Hey, fabulous listeners. So as I'd said, I was going to do a Q&A with the comment section. This is my response to some of the questions that piled up there after my last video on the first rule of manliness. So the first question came from the Ark, and the question was, how does one become worthy to serve without feeling like a fraud? In Eisenbach's Parzival, who is an ignorant country fool eager to become a knight, charges into King Arthur's court on his horse in his peasant clothes, spills wine in Guinevere, assume that's on Guinevere, and demands a suit of armor so that he can become a knight and serve Arthur. He wants to serve the highest, but makes a complete fool of himself, and when he gets the armor, he puts it on over peasant clothes, a fool in knight's armor. It seems necessary to be a fool before one can become a knight, but Parzival had the benefit of complete ignorance and innocence. How does one present oneself as a fool before the king without barging violently into the throne room? So this is a really interesting question because it kind of strikes at one of the core seeming contradictions of Christianity. 1 Corinthians 3:18 says, "Let no man deceive himself. If any man among you seems wise in this world, let him become a fool that he may be wise." So there's this sense in which you have to let go of what seems to be wisdom in this world, and you need to be willing to be made a fool in order that you can actually gain real wisdom, which has real substantial power. The second quote I'll give you is Ephesians 2:10, which is, "For we are his workmanship, created in Christ Jesus for good works, which God prepared ahead of time for us to do." So the contradiction here is that you want to come into the presence of God without seeming like a fraud or feeling like a fraud, and you want to do it in a way that isn't just barging into the throne room and asking for this divine blessing and the tools to serve the king. Now, what I think we need to understand about what it means to be a Christian is that there is this contradiction where we actually kind of are a fraud, if you want to use that terminology, that we don't have the means of approaching God in anything except foolishness. And you can't actually go into the throne room and ask to be armored for battle until you first acknowledge that you have nothing. And even in the works that we're going to do, that's the Ephesians quote, the works are actually his works that we will do because he's prepared them for us to do. And you don't come into this bringing anything. You have to come bereft of everything. That's why Jesus also says that if you want to enter the kingdom of heaven, you have to come like a child. I think one way to try and help understand what it is to serve the king in this way is, as an officer in the Canadian Army, when I was commissioned, I received a commissioning scroll. And that commissioning scroll said that I was basically being granted authority in the Canadian Armed Forces to serve as an officer of the Queen. So all of my authority was actually her authority. It was the authority of the Canadian government, which had been imparted to them from the Queen, right? And so I didn't come with any intrinsic authority, and I never gained any intrinsic authority. All of my career, whether it was as a second lieutenant, lieutenant captain, or major, regardless of how many people I commanded or how much authority was given to me, it was never my own authority, right? This authority was always the Queen's authority invested in me. This is what's called derived authority. So if we're going to serve as knights of the king, we do it because we are deriving our authority from him. None of it is from ourselves. We always are, in a sense, exercising the king's authority in what we do and not our own authority. So when you ask, how do I serve without feeling like a fraud? I think the answer is that you accept that truth. You recognize that you aren't actually carrying any personal authority, but you're only exercising his authority on his behalf. So one other further step in that analogy is to recognize that when I signed up to join the armed forces, I went off and I went to training. I had to come like a fool. I couldn't come and say, I already know all this stuff, because I didn't, right? I had accomplished things in my life up to that point. I was only 17, but, I nevertheless had academic accomplishments in high school and whatnot, and I'd read a lot of books, and I had done things, but that wasn't relevant really to what I had to learn to do, which was to lead men and to fight and to know how to operate all of the systems and use the language of the army, right? If I had come presuming that I had already things to bring to the table, then I would have actually failed in my basic training. I needed to divest myself of all self-worth, in a sense, and learn that all of my worth was going to be in what I learned to apply from the training I received. Certainly, you have inherent skills that can be honed into this new field, but they're nevertheless, those must be surrendered so that they can be sharpened for the trade that you're going into. This is kind of what it is to come into the throne room and ask to serve the king. You're not coming with all of your equipment and worldly knowledge and wisdom. You're coming as one who acknowledges that everything that I know and all of my skills are worthless until they are invested with his authority and according to the way that he wants me to exercise that authority. So you really do have to just embrace your fraudliness, I guess. That you're not actually coming into this situation as one who is worthy, but you're coming as one who is unworthy. You're not coming into the situation to exercise your skill sets and wisdom, but the ones that you will receive from him. So that's kind of my answer to that question. Don't think to come as one who is wise, but let yourself become a fool. Embrace your naivety in spiritual things and be willing and ready to be filled with new knowledge that will then empower you in wisdom. Don't come as one who is impressed with their own righteousness, but come with one who is ready to take on the righteousness of Christ. There's a very foundational fraudulence, in a sense, to what's going on in the Christian teaching of righteousness, because you don't come into God's presence based upon your works, but upon Christ's works. It says that you have your clothes which are washed white in his blood. You don't wash them yourselves. He washes them for you and gives them to you. So when you are righteous, it is because Jesus is righteous, not because you yourself have been righteous. So all of that just kind of leads us back to the place of humility, meekness, and embracing your naivety so that you might have new understanding. So that's my answer to that question. Knight Arnold had requested a video on the masculinity of Jesus. I will do that, but I'll give some teaser comments here because it's probably going to be a ways down the road before I try and tackle that whole subject. The masculinity of Christ is at once incredibly important and also not necessarily the best starting point, I guess, for what we try to embrace in our own expression of masculinity. And I'll explain why that is. Because Christ is the ultimate man, and we are to look at his example and to draw upon it and try and emulate that. And what we do see that we can absolutely take aboard is that Christ exercised power under restraint. That archetype of meekness is what Christ exemplified in everything that's written about him. That he, although he was God, he took on the form of a man. Although he was the creator, he became his creation. He condescended to be understood in the language of men. He became like us so that he could serve those who ought to have been serving him. There's that whole defense of the weak at personal cost thing that is just the very symbol that Christ presented to us of the ultimate manliness. To have power to destroy, but to use it to save, is the power of the ultimate man. And we definitely need to understand and embrace that and incorporate that into ourselves. But there is a sense in which, that whole what would Jesus do thing is just the wrong question. Because in a very real way, you are not Christ, and you cannot be Christ. You aren't a God, and you will never be a God, even if you accept Christ and you live as a Christian and you die as a Christian and you're reincarnated with a new and powerful body that's nothing like the one that you have now in the presence of God. You still won't be God. You'll be like him, but you won't be God. You won't be the creator. That's not the promise that's going on here. So you're not divine, and that makes it, a bit of a different story, right? Because if you were to look at, for example, the story in which all of the disciples and followers that are listening to Jesus, the great crowd, they come out into the desert, they want to hear him talk, he tells some parables, and then it gets late, and the disciples come to him and say, well, you need to send them home because they're hungry and we don't have food. And he said, well, we need to feed them. Well, Jesus' answer to this problem was he created bread and fish from kind of thin air. He took a few loaves and fishes and then he made them into enough to feed some 8,000 people, right? 4,000 or 5,000 men and all of the women and children. So I can't do that, right? I'm not going to turn the water into wine. I'm not going to manifest provision for the hungry. So there are ways in which we can't exactly take Jesus' example and say, well, I need to be like that. Well, I'll never be divine. But I can be like the kid who offered his loaves and fishes to Jesus, and then Jesus magically, supernaturally multiplied that into enough food to feed 4,000, 8,000 people. So because of that, that's kind of why I'm focusing on the Old Testament accounts, which give us examples of human archetypes of manliness, both with their good and their bad points. And sometimes for us, the bad points are actually more important for us to understand than the good points. Christ couldn't actually fail. He arguably was genuinely tempted, and in that sense sort of theoretically had the capacity to sin and to fail, but he was God, and so the temptations did all fail. He never sinned, he never fell short, he never compromised, but you are not strong like that, and neither am I. So for me, it's much more beneficial if I'm trying to understand what I need to do to see those examples so that I know what I can guard myself against, right? So when we go through Judges, we're going to look at the cases of the various judges. We're going to look at how they both succeeded in their manliness and what their downfalls were, those things which led them to their destruction or their failures, and then we can then guard against those things in ourselves. So there's often a lot more to be found in the negative examples than we often think. it's like we often said in the military that you learn from everybody. Sometimes you learn things that you ought to do, and a lot of the time you learn things that you must not do because you see their consequences. And wisdom comes from incorporating both. So we will look at the masculinity expressed by Jesus, and particularly all of that which we ought to incorporate into ourselves. But first, let's look at all the bad examples and see all the things that we ought not to do. You know, there's a reason why the Ten Commandments are written as negatives, and they tell you the things not to do, because it's really easy for us to take positive examples and then totally misuse them without first having the negative example to draw upon to know how we're not to apply that thing. So that's my answer, Knight Arnold, to your request. I will get to it, but let's take a journey first. Luca Zachariah said, "Hello, how would you know that the temporary king you are serving is in alignment to the ultimate king? I know that you can always compare him to the stories of the Bible and the example of Jesus, but things in process of becoming are always difficult to assess." That's absolutely true. I think, though, I'm going to give you the cop-out answer, which is actually the biblical answer on this one. That is, we actually don't have to worry about whether or not the king, the temporary king we're serving, is in alignment to the ultimate king. So Romans 13, for example, talks about how we are to submit to the government and give honor to those in authority over us, to submit to every earthly authority. And you have to understand that was written about the Roman pagan emperors and their governors and appointees, their armies and military regime overlords and all of that were incorporated into that argument that we submit to every human authority as a submission to God. So it's not the worthiness of the king that matters, it's the worthiness of God that matters. So if you looked at Ephesians 6, starting at verse 5, Paul said, "Slaves, obey your earthly masters with respect and fear and sincerity of heart, just as you would obey Christ. And do this not only to please them while they are watching, but as servants of Christ, doing the will of God from your heart. Serve with good will as to the Lord and not to men, because you know that the Lord will reward each one for whatever good he does, whether he is slave or free." So the really beautiful thing about the Christian rule of relationship is that all of your relationship in this world is actually first and foremost to God. You serve your earthly master. That might be your boss at your job. It might be your municipal authority. It might be your provincial or state authority. It might be your national authority. It might be the policeman who pulls you over. You submit to them even when they're unjust, because your submission is a submission to God and not to them. They aren't worthy of your submission. It's the same thing I was actually talking about at the beginning, where, you know, as an officer, I did not rule in my own strength and authority. I ruled with the authority derived from the Queen, and she, in turn, derived her authority from God. So it says that God puts the governing powers in authority, that the king's heart is a watercourse and he determines which way it will go. We know that no plan can possibly defy the will of God, no plan of men, so we don't worry about it. And we don't worry about whether or not our king is in alignment to the ultimate king. We serve them and obey them in all things, except where they demand an immoral act. And then, of course, we just refuse to participate in that. So I hope that maybe answers your question a little bit. If your president or king or queen or el dictator is an unjust tyrant and an immoral tyrant, then you nevertheless actually obey them. You do what they ask of you, even when it's not fair. Right up till the point where they ask you to commit something which is wrong, and then you refuse to do it and accept the consequences. And you'll be rewarded in that obedience by God. So if you take this principle and you extend it to every relationship, it's actually incredibly powerful. Like if you take it into your marriage, then you love your wife even when she doesn't deserve it because you're loving God in what you do. You love your children even when they don't deserve it, and you sacrifice for them because your sacrifice is to a worthy God, even when the children are not worthy. You submit to your boss, even when he's a jerk, and you do what he asks you to do because you're doing it for God, not for him, right? You love your friend and forgive them, even when they are kind of a thankless and not very kind-hearted person, because God is worthy of you forgiving them, right? Because of all that he has forgiven you for. And if you can incorporate that into yourself in every relationship, then all of a sudden the frustrations of life just kind of dissipate. It's like, oh, well, that person stole from me. That was not very good. And I can demand justice from my government, etc., etc. But well, that's between him and God, and I have been forgiven so much that I kind of just have to let that go. And I'm not saying that we don't demand justice and we don't teach and correct and rebuke when wrongdoing happens. I'm saying that on a personal level, I don't have to take offense all the time. I know that people are unjust. I know that they're fallen. I know that they're sinners. I know that they're weak. And so am I. So I guess I just have to kind of accept that that's reality and then work through it and soldier on for Christ. So those are my answers to the questions in the forum this time around. And if you appreciated this, then fire some more comments in the next time we get together on the old YouTubes or podcast, if I ever figure that one out. So I guess the word of the day is soldier on for Christ. Don't worry about your own worthiness. Don't worry about the worthiness of those that you're serving. Hooah.